Hey everybody, this is Draven. Today we have a nice little 5-game Major League Baseball slate that starts at 6:40 Eastern. Before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It helps the channel a lot. I really do appreciate it. Let's look at the weather first. While we're looking that up, I hope everybody did well yesterday. The Cubs really dominated the slate from a fantasy perspective, so that was very interesting. A lot of the pitchers did well too. Let's go ahead and look at the weather here. So we actually have a lot of weather on this one. With 5 games, 4 of them have weather concerns. The only game that doesn't is the Colorado LA Angels game, which actually looks like it's going to be a relatively high scoring game. So that's a good sign there. So let's look at this weather though and see what we consider risky here. So the Baltimore Cleveland game definitely has some issue. Looks like it will be something that we have to look at pregame, which again, that's the first game on the slate, so that's good for that at least. Same with Kansas City and Detroit. They're going to have some rain. Uh, Hopefully, it doesn't get delayed, but it definitely has some potential for that. The Miami Atlanta game has less risk here. It has some pop up stuff, but nothing super crazy. It doesn't look like maybe a slight delay at some point, but not too much. But the biggest concern is actually the St. Louis Chicago Cubs game because there's going to be scattered storms that are going to potentially cause some delays, and that game is later, so that is definitely not ideal there. On this particular slate, we do have some interesting things happening, as we do actually have the arcade, MLB arcade on DraftKings today as well, and I will kind of look at that here after I do the main slate stuff. So let's go ahead and get into this slate. Let's look at pitching first. So pitching is interesting today. That's a good way to put it. And Manga is going to be the top overall play for me, at least, as he has the best upside on the slate. He's been relatively consistent despite having a couple off games this season, but he's been pretty solid most of the year. His K rate looks pretty good here. He and Gray are the only guys that have project over 5 strikeouts, so and Manga does look really solid from that perspective, and he's probably my favorite play right now. He's not a core play just because he has too much of a low floor right now, and the K rate isn't super high, but it's still decent enough, and he's got the favorable matchup against St. Louis. Even though I do like a couple hitters for St. Louis, even in this matchup, I think he's still the best option on the slate. Lugo is the other guy that I think has a lot of potential today as a GPP play. Now, he has been up and down a lot recently. He started the season kind of better than he's been lately, so he's a little bit of a concern there, but he's still the best option, I think, outside of Imanga, so he's definitely got some potential here, and he's got a decent strikeout rate, even though it's not great. He does have a favorable matchup against Detroit, though, so that definitely helps. And then for extreme GPP plays, Gray is going to be one of those, as he has an unfavorable matchup against the Cubs. Now, the Cubs obviously had a big game yesterday. I don't necessarily expect that to continue again, but I do think he has some good potential here, as he's had 2 games against them, averaging 22 fantasy points. So he's definitely capable, but he's a high risk, high reward play on the slate, and the Cubs do project decently well today. Looking at a couple other players that we like, Charlie Morton has really been inconsistent lately. He's hard to roster right now because of that inconsistency. He's not had a super high ceiling lately. He does have it typically, though, but he's been giving up a lot of home runs in the last 4 games. He's given up 7 home runs, so that's quite a few. I'm a little concerned about that here, even though he is facing Miami, which is the weakest team. Even that said, Miami does have a couple guys that can hit them, and he had 12 fantasy points the one time he played them this year. He is in play, but he's definitely risky on the slate. Lively is also an extreme GPP play here for Cleveland against Baltimore. Now, I'd like him a lot more if he wasn't facing Baltimore, who does project as the second best team on the slate for this particular slate. So he's not in a great spot. The strikeout rate is not that great either, so I don't expect a super high ceiling game, even if he does well here. And so that is a little bit concerned, and Baltimore will most likely score at least a couple of runs at minimum. Looking at Max Mayer, he's another extreme GPP play. Now, he's actually only pitched 4 games, but he had an absolutely phenomenal game earlier this year against Atlanta where he had 7 strikeouts and gave up 1 earned run. I don't think he'll replicate that today, but a 15 to 20 fantasy point game is definitely doable, as he has had a decent enough strikeout rate in those games that he's played. but he's not in a great spot, and that's definitely a extreme. He was very borderline of being called a Hail Mary play, so do keep that in mind. And then we have two low-owned upside guys that have some high-risk situations, but they definitely have some potential. One being Carson Fulmer. For the Angels, he's facing Colorado, who's just objectively one of the worst offenses right now. Though they do have a couple guys that have some home run metrics today, and he has given up a couple of home runs the last few games he's played. He doesn't typically go super deep in games, so that's also a concern here. But he's definitely capable of shutting them down, at least for 4 or 5 innings, and can be a very good Hail Mary play. Except for the fact he's a little bit overpriced for that. Looking at Feltner for Colorado, he is facing the Angels, but he's the only guy on the cheap options that actually has had some good success against other teams, and so he's definitely in play today because he has had some pretty good, 15 to 20 fantasy point games as of late. Even though that's definitely more the exception than the rule, he still got some favorability today, especially with the strikeout rate being actually the best of the sub $8,000 players on this one. So he's definitely high risk, high reward, and he definitely fits into the arcade slate as well. But overall, I think he's largely avoidable unless you just want to punt a second position to help you pay up at other positions. Now, that's actually a concern today because the batting is not super cheap when it comes to the guys that look really solid. If I look at our core plays, I got David Fry and Lane Thomas. It's honestly going to be somewhat difficult to use both of these guys. The way the pricing is today, it's really unfavorable, especially if you stay pretty expensive with your pitching, which is probably the safest route at least. And so as we go through the bats, you'll notice that there's just not a lot of value here. But at catcher, David Fry is the top overall play. He has favorable matchup against Cleveland, against Baltimore, and he's got some good metrics for today. Not the best metrics I've ever seen, but he's definitely in play for a home run at least, as his home run metric is very high, even though he has been inconsistent lately. We also like Adley Rutschman, however, he's extremely expensive today, and he doesn't have the home run metric that Fry does, but he does have better hitting metrics, so that's definitely why he's in play here. The top ownership here is going to be strange with Travis d'Arnaud and Freddie Fermin. Low-owned upside guys, Salvador Perez and Logan Hope. I really think David Fry's the safest option, and so he's definitely worth rostering from that perspective. Looking at first base, Matt Olson does come off the page as a really solid play today. He's got a lot of home run upside. He's been hitting the ball very well lately. He monstered 2 home runs in his last game, and I look for him to continue to try to do that. He's been better lately despite the strikeouts. His batting average is slowly climbing up, and he's scoring a lot of fantasy points in these games. So he's definitely worth a look. Now, this position is probably the deepest on this slate. Paul Goldschmidt, if you don't use Imanga, is somebody that you have to consider here, as his metrics are just off the charts for the slate. But he's definitely in a high risk situation, and St. Louis does not project well as a team in general. Ryan O'Hearn for Baltimore is also a nice value play today. He has been somewhat inconsistent, but he's been hitting the ball better lately, and he does have that home run metrics today, which is actually nice here at first base. Looking at Pasquantino, Pasquantino is going to be a guy that's going to get some ownership today, and he's not way overpriced. He's a good contrarian play off of Matt Olson, and he has some good hitting metrics as well, though he's a little bit more inconsistent than Olson has been as of late. The ownership here is also going to be weird with Jake Berger, Vinny Pasquantino, and Nolan Chanel. And then, of course, Salvador Perez can fit in up here as well. When it comes to the value today, you're going to have to really just try to punt with some of the high-owned value plays and hope that they pay off and hope that you don't get spurned by the ones you don't use, because that's kind of the best case scenario on this particular slate if you're going to be able to pay up for anybody. Looking at second base, and man, this position is actually a good position to find some value that looks solid. One being Andres Jimenez for Cleveland. Now, he doesn't have that home run rate, but he does have good hitting metrics today, and I think he's in a good spot here where he can get a couple hits. He's been hitting the ball a lot lately. I think he's on a 7-game streak or 6-game streak or something like that. So he definitely has some potential, though he hadn't scored a ton of fantasy points in that range. He's one of the cheaper options available, and so he's definitely worth a look. Michael Massey, though, is also in play for Kansas City, as he's been getting a pretty decent metric today. He did hit a home run in his last game a couple of days ago, and I think he has some more home run potential today as well, though he's not a must-play by any stretch of imagination. But Michael Massey will be the top ownership at this position, likely with Brandon Drury and Luis Rengifo coming in behind him. And then, of course, Miguel Garcia can also play here at second base, who is a good contrarian play, kind of. Looking at third base, Jose Ramirez does jump off the page as a great option, though he has been absolutely tearing up the ball the last few games, and he's got some really nice upside again. Though he is extremely expensive, and he does need a hit a home run to pay off. Or you could pay for Austin Riley, who's $900 cheaper, with just as much upside on this particular slate. Now his batting has really improved lately. He's been pretty good against Miami this season so far, so he's definitely worth a look here. And being at home definitely favors him as well. If you want to get a little bit cheaper here, a kind of a punt play is Ryan McMahon for Colorado, as he's been probably one of the better players on Colorado all season long, and he's got favorable matchups here as well. Even though this game's on the road, even though that does hurt him some, even in his fantasy output, he's still got home run potential, and so that's definitely making him worth a look. The ownership here will be Brandon Drury, Jake Berger, Luis Rengifo, and Austin Riley, with Miguel Garcia and Nolan Arenado be the low-owned upside guys. So I do think that you can pay down here with Berger, but it's definitely a high risk, high reward situation there in third base. Looking at shortstop, this position is ugly as all get out. We have two guys that jump off the page is pretty good, and we do have one value play that we could look at, but Bobby Witt Jr. has been absolutely phenomenal all season long. He's playing very good. He's hitting the ball very well. He's not striking out much, and he's just doing everything right now. And so he's definitely in play. He's extremely expensive and hard to roster, though. Looking at Gunnar Henderson, on the other hand, he's also been hitting the ball very well. Now his metrics are uh, not as good as Witt's are today, but he's only $200 cheaper. But he's a good contrarian play off of him. The ownership here will be Bobby Witt Jr. and Orlando Arcia, and Arcia is the guy that we could kind of consider as a punt play at this position. He's nice and cheap here. He's hitting the ball pretty well lately, even if he only scores 7 or 8 fantasy points, he can still pay off for us, and that gives us some upside ability to maneuver around at other positions. Looking in the outfield, this is a position I really like today. There's a lot of great options here. Lane Thomas being the best. Now, you don't have to roster Lane Thomas, though he is in a very interesting situation now that he's traded to Cleveland. He's going to have some nice home run potential today. And he definitely adds something to this offense when it comes to that hitting potential. And he looks really solid today, so he's got a favorable matchup. Uh, some other guys we like that are somewhat expensive, Marcelo Ozuna. He's been absolutely phenomenal this season as well, though he has struggled the last few games when it comes to strikeouts. But he does have that home run upside, so he's definitely worth a look from that perspective as well. Taylor Ward is another guy that I really wanted to make a core play, very close to being one. I considered making him the core play instead of Lane Thomas, so you can go with both, but he's been hitting the ball very well lately. He's got a favorable matchup against Colorado's pitching. Even though Colorado's pitcher can do good at times, I think he's in a good spot here for a solid game, and he's been absolutely phenomenal as of late. Even though he hasn't hit the ball well much of the season, he is hitting it right now, averaging almost 8 fantasy points a game over the last 10, and he's nicely priced at $4,300. Looking at a few other options that we can look at that give us a little bit of depth. Tommy Pham for St. Louis, he's kind of a one-off here. Obviously, if you use uh, Cubs pitching, you probably want to avoid him, but he has been hitting the ball very well. He's had 3-hit games the last 5 games, which definitely gives him some added upside here as well. But he's definitely a little bit of a risky play because of the matchup situation there. Tyler Freeman is also interesting for Cleveland today. He does have some boom or bust potential here as he's got a low batting average on the season, but he did have a good game yesterday. He doesn't strike out too much. He also has some stolen base potential. Or I should say 2 days ago, he had a good game. So I think he's got some potential on this one as well. Joe Adele for the Angels is in play today as a home run or bust play. He has nice metrics, but he's high risk, high reward at this situation. And then Cedric Mullins. We haven't called his name in a while. I mean, I guess Baltimore hasn't actually been on the main slate a lot lately. But Cedric has struggled this season, but in the last week or so, he's really bumped it up, and he's had 4 in the last 5 games over 10 fantasy points. And all 5 of those games have been over 9 with good hitting in those. He's had only 1 home run in that stretch, but he's not striking out. So he's also getting walks some and getting some stolen bases, which really can boost his fantasy potential. Seems like he's seeing the ball well right now, finally. And as long as he can continue to get going, then hopefully he can become a guy that we utilize a lot down the stretch. Not only that, his price point is nice and cheap at $3,600. So if he can keep this going, this is definitely good for us. A couple other guys to consider: Cody Bellinger, Anthony Santander, and CS Suzuki are slightly more expensive contrarian plays. and some value plays: MJ Melendez, Mickey Maniac, and Jared Kalenic, Ian Hop, and Eddie Rosario. So the ownership of the outfielders: MJ Melendez, Lane Thomas, and Hunter Renfroe, Taylor Ward, Jorge Soler, and Colton Cowser. If Soler plays for Atlanta, I will definitely be considering him because he has been phenomenal in the past when he's played for Atlanta as well. So if we look at the top 6 overall plays on this slate, they are Bobby Witt Jr., Jose Ramirez, Lane Thomas, Gunnar Henderson, Matt Olson, and David Fry. My top home run hit likelihood upside guys are David Fry, Matt Olson, Gunnar Henderson, Marcelo Zena, Paul Goldschmidt, and William Contreras. Now, if we look at the arcade, we have a totally different setup and matchup here. The way that these work is they have different prices than the main, and you just put one pitcher in and you get a few batters. So you got to kind of mix and match some expensive guys with some cheaper options here. Taylor Ward does jump off the page as one of the best options, though, to utilize here at this on this arcade slate. So I definitely think he is a solid play to put in here. And as for pitchers, I think Imanga and Gray are probably the safest options there, though. I think Imanga is probably the safer of the two. A couple of the other bats that you could look at, Bellinger, Suzuki as expensive plays, and then some value plays. You could look at Ian Hop, uh, maybe Logan O'Hope, Tommy Pham. Let's see here. Uh, Mickey Maniac. Those are just a few of the guys that I think have some nice upside on this slate. So, with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Make sure to check out the weather concerns before 6:40 p.m. Eastern today to get ensured that these games are going to be played without too many issues, as a lot of them do have weather concerns. And make sure to check out the link in the description for Discord, as you can join there. And I try to post stuff that's pertinent for like